shared this morning, I don't know Howard Kenyon as well as some of the others. He lives in Oregon, and our paths hadn't crossed very often. The first time I heard him speak was at his mom's funeral service, and there was a lot of speakers, and proper honor was being paid, and it was a beautiful service, and a lot of people had spoken before he got up there, and he said, my mom didn't want a big fuss being made over her. And it just fit the moment so well, and it was so perfect. I thought, wow, I like this guy immediately. And when he's with the passing of his father and all that goes along with that, he's been in the area for a few weeks, and we were just so thrilled that his schedule worked with ours, that we were able to have him as our guest. He's the eldest son of Garrett and Anita Kenyon. Howard served in Chi Alpha campus ministry stateside before going to Taiwan and Northwest China with his wife Kim, where they were missionaries for 17 years. After moving to Oregon in 2007, he led a statewide nonprofit that provided services to people in need, including homeless youth, refugees, and immigrants. Howard is an earned doctorate in theological ethics from Baylor University and has published 2 books. He and Kim have 4 grown children. 3 of them are in ministry, including one that is in Chi Alpha campus ministry in, is it Corvallis at Oregon State University, following in their footsteps, and another, a missionary that has returned to China. And so we are so thrilled and so privileged to have Howard come and share with us today. And right before he comes, Uncle Tommy is still here, or is here too, and you're also my Uncle Tom, Uncle Howard, Uncle Tom. Everybody's my uncle. Neither of them like to be called Grandpa, so I left that out for both of them, but we're honored to have both of you here today. Howard, would you come and share with us? Let's welcome him today to Hope Assembly.
Well, it is a delight to be here, and I remember this church because we used to have CA rallies. Anybody remember CA? That's okay, you're aging yourselves here, but anyway, it's a delight to come back. I've been going through all the stuff in my folks' house. They lived in the same house for 63 years. It was the parsonage, and when they retired, the church let them stay in the house until they passed. And just a warning, folks, if you don't want your children to read stuff that you didn't want them to see, throw it away before you die. There's a scripture that says, whatever is hidden will be revealed. My parents didn't know how biblical they were. One of the things that I noticed was my baby picture. It reminded me that my mother had said before she had her children, the first child anyway, that's me, that she was praying for a cute baby. And I always thought, Mom, why did you stop there? It could have prayed for cute, older, handsome or whatever, but she only prayed for a cute baby, and so you're stuck with what she didn't pray for. But I mentioned this when I was in Millville last Sunday where I spoke, and that is, I found a report card where I was in elementary school where she wrote, in those days the parents wrote notes on the back of the card anyway, and she'd written, so grateful for all the good accomplishment Howard has, and we're praying for humility for him. Could have just stuck with cute, Mom. But there's another memory that comes to mind when I'm here in Malaga at this church, because if you go just 3 miles away, and I'm not familiar with the roads, so I looked them up. So there's Marshall Mill Road, which you all would know, right? And you go down, and there's a road called Stanton Avenue. Now, I thought it was called Janvier or Javier if you were watching Les Mis or something like that. But anyway, you go down that road, and there's a place, and I don't know the name of the street because it didn't matter to me when I was a kid, called Butch's Lane. Anybody familiar with that area? It's just 3 miles from here. And right across from Butch's Lane, I don't know which place, because if I drove down there, I'd probably get shot because it's back in the woods a little bit, was a chicken farm, or as my cousin would say, a poultry farm. And my Uncle Garrett had moved, before my parents ever heard of Millville, my Uncle Garrett, my dad's uncle, so it's my great Uncle Garrett, not that the others weren't great, but that's what we called him, was great Uncle Garrett, moved to what we called Vineland, although I think it's north of Vineland, in the 1940s, and started a poultry farm. And when I was growing up, that was a great place to go because I learned all kinds of things like lady slippers and staying away from the geese because they're very dangerous, and what a skunk was after the fact, and what double-oaked egg looks like, a double-yolked egg, or an egg with a soft shell on it. All these kinds of fascinating things because my Uncle Garrett was a chicken farmer, as I knew him. But anyway, poultry farmer. So it was a fascinating place to explore and learn and grow. Now, to me, driving up, I came up Main Road this time because I wanted to go past it this morning before coming here instead of 55. When I was a little kid, we didn't have 55. And then when we got it, it didn't go anywhere. Remember those days? It was the most useless highway in the U.S. But you drove up Main Road, and so you got took the little jog to get to his place, and it brought back lots of memories, even though I didn't drive down that road where a guy probably has a shotgun waiting for me. But we made that journey, and it felt like a long journey. Well, it's nothing today, but it felt like when you went to Malaga, it was long distance back in those days. Philly was a huge event to go to. Now you go to Philly for anything. Well, the story we're talking about, Christmas story, is about what we call the wise men. And though they were the magi, but that's what we call them, wise men. And we've come up with this cliche called wise men still seek him. Now, I'm a cliche buster. And the reason I don't like cliches is because we say something often enough, we stop thinking about it. You ever notice that? You say it too many times. Just say a word over and over again. I used to do this as a kid. You say a word over and over again, and you can't even remember the meaning of it because it suddenly becomes meaningless. That's what happens with cliches. So wise men still seek him is true, but when's the last time you really thought about it? It's like God is good all the time. God is good all the time. Stop and think about it. Don't just say that. Think about what you're saying. Anyway, I'm not meddling. That's what my dad would do. So we get beyond the cliche. So here's the Magi in the New Testament. And this has to be the Matthew's story of the Nativity and the wise men that come has to be the most bizarre, strangest story ever in the New Testament. I mean, forget the virgin birth. This is the weird one. It's these guys who come. There may have been 3, there may have been 33. Nothing has ever said about it. And they're coming from probably what is Persia. And they are magi, which means they are, just hold your ears, folks, if you can't handle this, they're astrologers. Now, that doesn't mean the Bible's condoning astrology. It just means that people are looking for Jesus, and they don't know anything about him. They don't know that they're looking for Jesus. Now, if some of you are stopping to think and say, wait, why doesn't this come later what shouldn't we be dealing with this story later in December? I mean, some of you are really purists and you think it should happen on January 6th. Keep in mind that when did these guys start out from Persia? Way back when Jesus was born. It took them a year to get there. They didn't have the super highways we have today. And then the other thing to keep in mind is they were looking for this star long before, because that's what they did. They looked at the skies and they perceived things. So they were interested in truth before they ever saw Jesus wherever it was there in Bethlehem. They were looking for him. So they started out ages before Jesus was born, looking in the sky, trying to discern what is going to happen. What is the sign we're going to see? They were sign lookers. And they started out and they followed the star till it landed in the Jerusalem area, and then they happened to bump into King Herod, which was a bad news, and we won't go into that story too much today, all the stuff about killing babies and so on. I'll leave that for your pastor to sort out later. But I want you to look at Matthew verses 1 and 2. We're just going to take a look at a couple verses as a springboard for this whole story here. And it says in Matthew chapter 2, the first 2 verses, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of Herod, King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." I'm fascinated by these magi, these wise men as we like to call them today. These people, because they were question askers, they were always pondering things, they were trying to sort out what the world was made of and why it worked the way it did. Now, we don't know a whole lot. We know they came and they worshiped Jesus and they went home. That's all we know about it. Everything else is just pure speculation. There's all kinds of stories that might conjure up and so on that, but we don't really know much about them. But we do know this. They came looking for what they perceived was the birth of the King of Israel. They were asking questions. Now, Herod asked questions too, because when they came to Herod, well, he didn't ask questions, but he was curious about what was going on, and they talked to King Herod, and King Herod's reaction was, "We've got to snuff this baby out." So it's a dark story. But the difference between the Magi and King Herod is that the Magi had questions. King Herod really was a non-believer. And I'd like to posit this as two different things. One is the Magi had doubts and King Herod had unbelief. And I know people don't like the word doubt, but I like the word. Because I've struggled with questions all my life. I've wrestled with questions. Well, why does God allow this in my life? And why does God allow this in the world? Sorry, Justin, just blew your ears out there. And so doubt, I've discovered, actually has some good qualities to it. Now, some of you are starting to zone me out because you think, oh, Christians can't doubt. But think about this for a second. What does a doubter do? One asks questions. You say, well, I know people that are pretty skeptical. That's not a doubter. A skeptic is a non-believer. A non-believer stops asking questions. You can be a Christian and stop asking questions, and you become a non-believer because you never keep exploring who God is. So, think about this for a second, is that the difference between doubting and unbelief is this. Doubting says, I've got the world figured out this way, but I'm not sure about this piece, and we start to tug on that piece, and sometimes it opens up a whole new realm of possibilities for us. When we lived in China, in the university there, we couldn't talk about our faith, but we could answer the students' questions when asked. And what I discovered was students were growing up in a world where they had their whole world figured out for them. It had been handed to them and they said, this is the way the world operates, and God is not a part of it. So I didn't have to say to them, oh yes, God exists, and have an argument with them. I simply let them start asking questions. Now think about it. I'm coming from the United States to China, and the authorities in China are saying, we don't like what they teach in the United States, but this person is a foreign expert, and they're coming to teach you on certain subjects. And all of a sudden, they realize that there's somebody outside of their world that has something to say that the government approves. I was approved by the government to come there and speak. Only on certain subjects, but they were taught that only that government system understood what truth is all about. And yet here's this foreigner coming in who is teaching and approved by the government. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. So they would start to ask questions. Well, and they called me, they didn't call me Kenyon, but they called me doctor over there, which you don't have to do. It's unless you're going to pay me. I don't mind money, but the title means nothing to me unless it has greenbacks with it. But they'd call me Dr. Gu or Gu Borscher. And they'd say, well, you teach us this, so you must understand something about truth. And then they start to ask questions. So we live in a world here in South Jersey where people have their worldview all wrapped up. They know exactly what it is. They may be Christians, they may not be, but they don't want to ask any questions outside of that box. And you come in with a slightly different perspective, and it throws them off. They don't want to have anything to do with it. So either they kick you out because they don't want to listen to you, or they start to ask questions. And it might take them 20 or 30 years, but, oh, so you're a Christian, but you're actually kind of nice. Why is that? That's a question. And what I discovered with the students there in the city I was living in, it was like this hard concrete, and a crack would form, and a plant would grow up in the middle of the concrete. That's what God does when he comes into our lives. He breaks the mold. We have our world figured out, and then God walks in, and we start to become curious. Curiosity, and I like to say doubt, is the first step towards the cross. It's the first step towards coming to know Jesus. When we start to question our own lives, we start to ask questions. Some people call it the examined life. That means you're thinking through life. People don't become believers in Jesus unless they start to question their own lives. And that's what the Magi were doing. They were raising questions. They were trying to figure out what all this meant. What is the meaning of all of this? Herod, on the other hand, was a non-believer. And I don't mean in the sense that he didn't like Jesus. I mean in the sense that he was not going to think outside of the box, and therefore he went mad. He went crazy because he could not let his world grow. He could not let his world expand. He was actually afraid is what it was. I mean, what's a baby going to do? He's going to be dead by the time the baby's grown up as king. But for him, it was threatening. Anything that was changing was threatening. And so he couldn't handle it. Now, as believers, I'm not just talking, if you're a non-believer today, ask all kinds of questions. If they can't handle it, then Pastor Randy has permission for them to write me because I can handle any question, okay? But I know you can handle good questions. Actually the hard ones I'll send back to you, Pastor. But as believers, when we stop asking questions, we stop growing. Think about it. We serve a very big God. And I said this in a very different sermon last Sunday, is that if we get to the point where we think we know everything about God, then our God is way too small. We're never going to know everything about God. We will spend an eternity trying to figure out God and learning more and more about him all the time, because my God is far bigger than my finite brain, and I don't want a God that's that small. Because otherwise I'd be worshiping myself, because I would know as much as God. So there's so much to learn and explore about God, but there are believers who stop growing and they live their lives in this little tiny place without realizing there's so much more to understand about God. Years ago, there was a healing evangelist, Catherine Kuhlman. Any of you remember her? I went to a service of hers, a big, huge event in Tampa, Florida, when I was going to college at Florida Southern next to Southeastern years ago. And it was an amazing event because she didn't have a prayer healing line. She would simply speak, and then she'd ask if people had been healed, that they'd come forward. So the only ones that got on the platform had had a healing. And there was a man sitting, probably from me to that piano, and all of a sudden he realized there was something physical that he knew had changed in his body, and I don't remember what it was. That was about 300 years ago when I was at this event. And so he got up and he went to the platform, and Catherine Kuhlman asked him, she said, now, he said, what was it that he had been sick for, and now he was healed? She clarified all that, and she says, now, do you believe in Jesus? And the man said, no. She says, would you like to? And the man says, no, I don't think so. And he went and he sat down. Now, the irony of that is that he was still healed. But he didn't ask questions. He didn't go beyond that moment. And so he could have, years later become a believer. I wouldn't know because I didn't keep in touch with him. I don't even know his name and never met him. I just saw him walk up there and then come back down. But he was not a believer, but God had healed him. He had experienced God in his life, and he didn't ask any questions about that. He simply stopped growing. He probably had stopped growing long before, and yet God was merciful to him. You see, God's healing of him had nothing to do with what he was doing. It had to do everything with what God was demonstrating, and it gave me a perfect illustration, 75 years later. That's why he was healed, so I could tell you that story this morning. Now, there's a friend of mine, and some of you know her, named Luella Dreyer. She's 104. There's nobody her age left that she can relate to. And she was we call it middle school now. She was my junior high school 8th and 9th grade algebra and French teacher. And I used to love her class because if I didn't do my homework, I'd simply say, Mrs. Dreyer, and I'd ask some random question that had nothing to do with algebra or French, and we'd be off to the races because she was curious. She was always fascinated, and I knew I could get her off track if my homework wasn't done. But she kept growing, and she was a believer at that time, but she kept growing as a believer, and I just visited her. She's in a get this, it's not a nursing home, it's a, what do you call it, rehab place, because she's planning to go home. She's 140, she broke her hip in September, and she's headed home as soon as she can get so she's working to get back home. It's amazing to me. And I was talking to her, and she can't see very well anymore, but she's listening to this podcast, and she's telling me, she says, she knows I'm from Oregon. She says, now out there they have a trail kind of like the Appalachian Trail. I says, yeah, the Pacific Crest Trail. She says, I know, I've been listening to this series, and I'm fascinated by it. Now listen to this, she's 104, and what she says to me is, I'm learning so much. Now that, my friend, is someone who's growing. And you can see it in her spiritual walk in her life. She's still growing. There's so much more for her to explore. She's ready for Jesus to take her home, but she's ready to stay here. And the odd thing is, no matter how long she's here, she has just as much of eternity as if she were to go today. So why hurry, Get over there, and it's the same amount of time. But for her, there's so much to learn and explore and grow because she hasn't arrived yet. She hasn't finished growing. And that's what God calls us to, is a life that asks questions, that's curious, that raises questions. Are we sure about that? Now, I'm not talking about somebody gets into conspiracy theory. Sorry if you're a conspiracy theorist, Pastor, but that's not somebody that's asking questions. That's somebody who's constructing a universe that won't allow any questions into it. That's what conspiracy theories are. A world in which we ask questions is open to all kinds of possibilities, because I trust God that no matter what rabbit trail I'm going to go down to, I'm going to find God at the end of it. I'm going to find Jesus at the end of it, because he is the one who has all truth. So you see, my friend, as a Christian, God calls us to explore and to listen. And I suggest to you as well that for this Christmas season, you never stop asking questions. Take the Christmas stories, and they're very traditional, and we have a lot of things wrapped up in them that are extra biblical, Santa Claus, that kind of, sorry, the kids are out. Anyway, all these things, they're nice, but dig deeper, go way deep, figure out where they are, Find out about St. Nicholas, who preached against heretics, the real Santa Claus, But explore and dig, and it's okay to celebrate things that aren't in the Bible, that's all right, just don't worship them. But ask questions. Some of you have been through Christmas as long as I have, or even longer, This is what would this be, my 68th Christmas. 68 Christmases, but it never gets old. Why? Because there's always something new to learn and explore and understand. Because I serve a God who's far beyond my finite mind, who's far beyond what I understand of God now. And there's so much more he has to teach me. When I was a teenager, and this is, Raymond, I don't even know if you were around at this point, because I was in 7th grade, so you do the math on this one. But this was, I don't know when you were born, but I know you were born, but I don't know when. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I believe you. I don't know if I will ask a question to make sure about that later, but we'll get into that another time, because I told you to keep asking questions. But when I was in the 7th and 8th grade, the young people came home from youth camp. And they were like, why can't church be more like youth camp? And my mother, who always loved questions, she said, well, where do you sit when you're at youth camp? Well, up front. Where do you sit in church? In the back. And she went through a whole list of things to show us that it wasn't youth camp that was different. It was our expectation, or is our anticipation about church or youth camp that was different. That sparked a revival and these were the days of revival. This is the late 60s, early 70s, those radical years when people say, oh, that was terrible years, but actually they were wonderful years. The charismatic movement, the Jesus movement, all kinds of things, good things were taking place because people were asking questions, those long-haired hippies, They were asking questions. It was a wonderful time to be alive because the people in churches often weren't asking any questions. But those people had the questions. And that's when the Holy Spirit moved on them. Anyway, back to my story, is that in that church in Millville, over the next 3 or 4 years, we saw the youth group grow from about 15 or 20 to about 60 or 80 because people were getting saved and coming in because the young people were asking questions like, why can't church be more like youth camp? Which sounds skeptical. It sounds like a non-believer, but my mother didn't take it as a skeptical non-believer question. Not as a challenge. She took it as, there's hunger there. They want to know what's going on. They want to understand more. Why isn't there something more? And it opened their hearts to all kinds of possibilities because they were asking questions. Now, I grew up, we went to Pine Grove Camp just down the road, isn't it? Really close. Part of this church, I know. But there was camp meeting movements actually started in the 19th century. Many of you know this information, is that the first national camp meeting was in Vineland back in 1867. But the holiness movement had actually started before that, and the holiness movement grew into the Pentecostal movement, and we are products of that today. And the reason they grew into that, and I was always fascinated by, well, let me back up a second. When I was in my 20s, I was really wrestling with God, asking questions. And it wasn't that I didn't believe in God, it was that I couldn't reconcile the God I knew with what had happened in my world. Couldn't bring the two together. Pain and suffering and tragedy in my own life, and how does that reconcile with the God that I know? And I was doing research on 19th century roots to the Assemblies of God, because that was part of my doctoral work, that second book that came along. And I began to dig into how the holiness movement grew, how the Pentecostal movement grew, and it was because people were asking questions. They were questioning the church world as they knew it at that time, their own lives, their own faith. And it started here in Vineland, of all places, and grew into a national movement that then grew until and this, I'm really truncating the story, until Azusa Street spread the Pentecostal message. They were calling themselves Pentecostals before speaking in tongues. That was because they were looking for a new Pentecost, something to be rebirthed. And all of that came out of that. And there's all kinds of stories that are fascinating to have the roots in South Jersey, right just a stone's throw from here, well, maybe 2 or 3 stones throw. But it was a movement of people who continued to ask questions. Now, I say that today, my friends, because God loves us, everyone. And He wants us to keep growing. And as long as we're on this good old earth, He has a mission for us. Well, there's other things to do, like reach the lost and show compassion and change people's lives and all that kind of thing, but it's also to know Him. And I know we have an eternity to explore that, but for some reason, He wants us to do it here in this context, because there are things that we have to learn here before we get over there about who God is, that we can only understand in this life. And so He calls us to never stop learning, never stop growing, but to be like the Magi who keep looking until they find their answers. I mentioned my Uncle Garrett and his farm, his poultry farm, just 3 miles away. In later years, I think they sold the farm or he closed it down because he got very sick. And they had called it a house in town, which meant it was over on Landis Avenue, pretty close to Landis and Maine. And he was quite frail, around the age of 80 was all, but he'd been very sick. I think it was cancer. And my mother and my siblings and I went up to sing Christmas carols for him at Christmas time. He didn't die till a little while later, but it was a long, long process of passing away. And we're in that house, and I think I took my violin. That was the obligatory thing to do, was take your violin and play along. But we were singing the carols. We all knew them by heart. Even my mother knew them long after her mind started to go. She could still sing all the verses, even if she couldn't say your name. But in this house with Uncle Garrett, we're singing Christmas carols to him, and I didn't really know where he was in terms of his faith. We really didn't know. And my mother stopped at one point. We'd sung all the familiar carols. Every time you say a phrase around Christmas time, it sounds like a song. Sang all the familiar carols, sounds like a Christmas line. But anyway, sang all the familiar carols, and Mom said to our Uncle Garrett, what's your favorite Christmas carol? What would you like us to sing? And without missing a beat, he said, but I know whom I have believed. Now, if you're not familiar with that song, I'll sing it for you, and then if you want to join in to cover up my bad singing, but I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. There's verses to it in the hymn book, you can find it. You think about that, that's not a Christmas carol. There's nothing about Christmas in it. But for Uncle Garrett, it was exactly the song he wanted to hear in that day, because it was a declaration, a testimony to the faith that was in him. That the things that he had given to God, and it's a scripture verse, it's in Paul's writing, that God was going to keep that. And it was a declaration, yes, I've lived the examined life. Whatever happened in the past, I know now where I'm going. And God is hanging on to that. So if you ask me on another day, what's my favorite Christmas carol? And I would have said it today, except that everybody would have said, what's he talking about? I would have said, one of my favorite Christmas carols is, but I know whom I believed. And I'm persuaded that he will keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. That's one of my favorite. We used to sing Christmas carols all the time, go to the hospital, we'd sing through the hospital. Doris Walker and I would play our violins through the hospital, up the senior high rises in Millville, and you walk all the way down the floors. You could see it all, hear it all over the place. And if you ask me what was my favorite Christmas caroling moment, so Uncle Garrett's house over on Landis Avenue, close to the main intersection, where he said, I know whom I believe. And he's got me. He's taking care of me. Don't stop asking questions. Don't let your kids stop asking questions. Much as it'll drive you crazy. Because they might get to 104. They still want to learn more about the Pacific Crest Trail. And even more importantly, they want to know more about Jesus. Thank you very much.